We are back for a final president from the era of the 60s. That's right, your friend and mine, Richard M. Nixon. And so we're going to take a brief look at Nixon's life and his presidency and ultimately his downfall. Richard Nixon is remembered in history mostly for the two pictures that are on the right. These picture him as President of the United States in 1974, deeply embroiled in Watergate, trying to figure out how to navigate kind of those murky waters that will ultimately lead him to resign the presidency. He's the only man to do so. But the nation really meets Richard Nixon in the picture on the left. In the 1950s, we already talked about, he was a vice president. And in the 1960s, he runs in a very close presidential election to John F. Kennedy. He gets his start in Washington in the House of Representatives. He'd served in World War II. He's from California. And so eventually goes from the House of Representatives to the Senate, where he gets a reputation as being quite hard on communism. It's kind of interesting if you want to go back, if you remember kind of the era of McCarthyism, and the 50s were a time of a lot of worry about the communists. And so he is somebody that gets a reputation as being very hard on them. And so when Dwight Eisenhower is looking for a running mate for President of the United States, Richard Nixon checks a lot of boxes, right? He's got a lot of experience with domestic policy. He's got experience with legislation. He's from a huge state out west, and he's also much younger than Eisenhower is. So he checks a lot of different boxes. As a vice presidential candidate, he almost flames out before he can even get started. There's a controversy over a fund that he had in the Senate, and he gets accused of basically kind of having a slush fund, what we call a slush fund today. He gives a really famous speech on television, though, called the Checker speech, where he says the only thing he's ever taken kind of as a perk while being a politician is a farmer gives a dog to his two young daughters. And I'll put the speech up on the playlist for you. It's an interesting look to see him use television really to his advantage, when ultimately he'll go on to kind of feel like it's a disadvantage in 1960 when he's running for President of the United States. A lot of people say that the difference was Nixon's performance in these televised debates. That Kennedy came off a little better on television than he did. And it's really a razor-thin margin between the two men. And so this kind of gets a little bit of the blame. He goes back, tries to run for governor of California, doesn't win, and tells the assembled press, you're not going to have Nixon to kick around anymore. Basically figures his political career is over. It's not. In 1968, he makes a rather dramatic comeback. The Democratic side's a mess, right? We talked about President Johnson. He's not going to run again for President of the United States. And so there's a real scramble. Eugene McCarthy, Robert Kennedy. There are a lot of different people vying for the Democratic nomination. Kennedy probably has a pretty good shot, but he ultimately, as we know, is assassinated after the California primary. And Nixon, the Republican candidate, is elected, promising to bring peace with honor to Vietnam. Talked about what a difficult task that was going to be. He settles on a policy of Vietnamization, the idea that the United States is going to train troops from South Vietnam to take the place of the over 500,000 American soldiers who are there. And as that training takes place, we'll start to rotate our own folks home. Domestically, he does some really good stuff as President of the United States. Even though he gets this reputation of being really hard on communism, he signs a couple of very influential treaties with the Soviet Union. The SALT Treaty, Strategic Arms Limitation, which basically both sides agree to reduce the number of weapons that they're stockpiling in the Cold War. he takes the country off of the gold standard, which kind of transforms the economy of the early 1970s. And probably the biggest thing he does is he, as a sitting U.S. president, will visit China and opens China up to the West. Now, obviously, China, today, as I'm recording this in 2021, there are issues between the two countries still, but you really, can trace back some of this this growth that they're going to have to this opening up. In 1970s, basically what he's doing is he's trying to get another ally in this struggle against the Soviets. Even though the Soviets and the Chinese are both communist, the countries don't like each other a whole lot. And so it's almost one of those things, if you ever heard the old phrase, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, kind of what fits in this category. I'll throw another video up on the playlist for you about that. Probably the thing most people remember Nixon for, though, is the Watergate scandal. The picture I've got here is the Watergate Hotel. If you've ever seen this, it may be in Forrest Gump, right when Forrest has participated on the ping pong team that has gone to China, comes back, and President Nixon puts him up in the Watergate Hotel. In reality, sadly, Forrest Gump, not real, but there's a break-in in the Watergate. It wasn't just a hotel. There were shops and office space, and the Democratic National Committee had their office space at the Watergate. Some Republicans break in, and they're going to steal some documents, bug some phones, that sort of thing. They bungle the job. They get caught. And very quickly, the situation starts to get out of hand. Now, Richard Nixon was going to win the presidency easily in 1972. Probably where they're trying to gain advantages are in those down-the-ballot races, the House and Senate races in different places. But worried about how this is going to look, basically, Nixon tries to use the power of the presidency to discourage the investigation. Today we call that obstruction of justice. And so there's a long 2-year period of time where there's an investigation going on. There's a famous book/movie called All the President's Men that does a really nice job of kind of showing how these two reporters track down sources to figure out, yes, this is something to be very concerned about. Nixon maintains his innocence all along. He's really done in by a series of recordings that he'd done on meetings and telephone calls in the Oval Office that the Supreme Court of the United States will require him to turn over to investigators. Looks like he's going to be impeached in the Senate, impeached by the House and sent to the Senate. Before that can happen, he becomes the first president to resign his office. He will try to rehabilitate his image. One more movie to mention is the one Frost versus Nixon, maybe 10 years old now, based on a play, but the movie's quite good, where it's this defiant Richard Nixon several years after he's resigned, trying to tell his side of the story to David Frost, who was a British kind of television personality. And Nixon ultimately admits that there was some wrongdoing, that he'd failed the American people. He retires back to California and, of course, doesn't really have any type of political life after that. But it is one of those situations, kind of like we talked about with Johnson in Vietnam. Hadn't been for Vietnam, maybe we remember Lyndon Johnson differently. If it hadn't been for Watergate, we certainly would remember Richard Nixon differently. We don't know how those last several years of his presidency would have turned out, but it would have been interesting to see, how he finished up, what would have happened in Vietnam, for instance. Would he send troops back once North Vietnam invades South Vietnam? But those are what-if questions, right? We don't have any idea what would have happened there. So that is a little bit about Richard Nixon.